giving a series of talks on the evolution of God, in part because I have so much information in my head after 28 years of research. I've got to find a way to share this stuff. But I've combined it with the theme of connection and prayer. And today I also want to talk about that period there where we moved into the Iron Age and how God became more masculine, because God did not start out masculine in the Homo sapien experience. God was truly represented as a feminine experience, feminine expression. And so we'll be talking about how that shifted and how it's important for us to understand the purpose of prayer and how sometimes people misinterpret what prayer is. So I'm going to have Reverend Liz read to you from the front of your program something I wrote in regards to connection, a book I wrote called The Secret According to Jesus.
Let come your kingdom, your authority. Emerson said we must get our bloated nothingness out of the way. If you really want the life God created you to live, you must stop trying to create it yourself. Instead, form a partnership with God, and then let come your kingdom. The Spirit knows and the law obeys. Buddha says, all that we are is a result of what we have thought. My kingdom, the life I was created to live, is right now ready to be lived. So why is there resistance? Every person must ultimately accept responsibility for how they think. Prayer will not change the way you think unless you let it. This is why this great prayer starts by recognizing the universal mind, seeing it as the holy nature of all life. Then it commands this goodness to move and to manifest by means of this life you were given to live. This is the feeling of having a life, not thinking about having a life.
Thanks, Liz. I amuse myself sometimes when I think about the life I'm supposed to live versus the life I'm actually experiencing. And there's a lot of confusion in people's minds about that. Because everybody has expectations about what's supposed to happen, and then there's the life you actually experience. What is it Paul McCartney said? Life is what happens to you while you're making plans. So this concept of connection and this concept of the evolution of the idea of God functioning by means of each of us is interesting. And I started out the first talk I gave on this series by talking about the Paleolithic and Neolithic era, which goes back some 50 or 60,000 years, which most theologians just completely ignore, that they didn't think there was anything going on there. But in fact, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that indicates that that humanity at that point, which, by the way, had the same capacity, brain power that we have today. Not the skills, obviously, not the maturation, but the same abilities to feel things emotionally and to think things through. And one of the things they thought through was this birth, death, and regeneration concept, which they kind of analogically figured out by observing the moon. And then the talk I gave after that was about the great above and the great below, how our minds tend to think in duality, and there's an in, there's an out, there's an up, there's a down, there's a right, there's a wrong. This is a natural human tendency, but it also has to do with how we evolve what we think God was. And we kind of turned God into more of our image, we call anthropomorphic, where we turn God into the image of mankind, rather than allowing God to emerge by means of us. So then I talked last week about some of the contributions that the great Greek philosophers gave, pre-Socratic, and also Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And it was a brilliant discourse. I really enjoyed it. No ego here whatsoever. Anyway, so all of that's available. By the way, we're filming all these talks, and you can see them on the website. If you go to the website, you can watch all the talks in case you missed them. So today I'm going to talk about the idea of connection and how important it is for us to learn how and what prayer is and how to do it. A lot of people are sort of confused by prayer too, because most of the Western world is convinced that prayer is begging God to do something. And usually prayer is the thing we do, the last call of resort. You know, the minister only gets the call when everything's gone, and everything else that you've tried has not worked. And so typically, part of my job is to help people get into this consciousness, this awareness, that what's happening is actually the right thing to happen. There's an old saying in our philosophy that says, you're always in your right place, and it's always the right time, and whatever you're experiencing, you're supposed to be experiencing. And so that instantly, if you can accept that, brings a sense of resolve, emotional resolve, because then you can say, okay, if I'm here and this is happening, what is trying to emerge by means of me? Which is what Emerson was saying when he said, get your bloated nothingness out of the way, which means your sort of exaggerated sense of the doom and gloom of what you think is going to happen. Because it's never about the doom and gloom. It's always about opening up your heart. Opening up your heart to love. Now, that might sound corny to some, especially if you're analytically trying to figure everything out. Could it be just as simple to open up your heart and accept that there's a great power of love moving by means of you? And if you could you allow that love to just begin to inform you of how to live your life in that moment? In that moment. It's not about what you're going to do next week or what you're going to do tomorrow or even this afternoon. But who are you right now in this moment? Now, in the Iron Age, about 3,500 years ago, when writing was starting to be perfected and expressed, and they were writing down all of the ancient tribal customs, what we call oral history traditions. And if you're not interested, or if you're not necessarily interested but not informed about history, oral history comes before written history. Oral history is the stories we tell each other about what happened. And you know how varied that can be. So Napoleon said that history is just a fable agreed upon. We just agree upon a bunch of circumstances, and we call that history. Now, historians, of course, might want to debate that issue, but I don't claim to be a historian. I'm a minister, for God's sakes. I don't debate history. But I do know that history catches up to a lot of people in a lot of interesting ways and kind of pushes them this way and pushes them that way and creates opinions and judgments and comparisons that are not only unreasonable, but completely illogical in what you're becoming and what's trying to become you as you grow and as you exist on the planet Earth. So this is also the time when Jesus appears on the scene, and I talked about the Socratic philosophers that came along, the Greek philosophers, but it's also the time where we finally begin to see that that feminine idea of the nature of the divine is beginning to be usurped, covered up, if you will, by a dominating masculine concept. And we have this in Genesis 1:26, where it says in the Bible, let us make mankind in the image, or let us make ourselves in the image of man, or something like that, where we're talking about this concept that we're making God in the image of man, or we're making man in the image of God. Well, that eliminates about 50% of the planet from participating in that process, of course. So, but it's not just about men and women and masculine and feminine. It's about a balance. It's about finding a balance within us that was more perhaps along the lines of being receptive to greater ideas and more compassionate, while also starting to express more authority in how we live our lives. So this concept of God the Father tends to appear around this period of time, begins to dominate, and begins to have this sort of push in Western religions. Now, not nearly as much in Eastern religions, but some, mostly in Western religions. And so Jesus, when he was praying, of course, the great Lord's Prayer begins in the Western translation as Our Father, which of course is that authority, which is masculine. But the word in Aramaic is really not about our Father. The word in Aramaic is Awun. Awun. Say that. Awun. Now, picture, if you will, Mediterranean, around the Semitic area of the planet, and you have all of these guys dressed in robes and in a sort of a dimly lit room, a lot of dust and things around, and Jesus is saying, pray like this, and he has them say, Awun. Say that. Awun. You hear the difference in Our Father versus what you just said in unison? There's an energy generated by language. I'll say that again. There's an energy generated by language. And even if you don't say it, what some people might say the correct or proper way that you're supposed to say something, if you can feel the energy of the word, that's the purpose of the word, is to express that energy. Now, another thing about language, in my limited linguistic experience, all language is metaphoric. All language is an attempt to explain one thing by expressing another thing. So when we say Ahum, which has been translated in the Western tradition as Our Father, but in the Eastern tradition, the Aramaic tradition, it's more like that authority, that creative power which starts life, sustains life, and completes life. Starts life, sustains life, completes life, which means comes into expression and then has an experience and then stops. But what keeps going is that which stops starts life again immediately. In music, we have a term called, this is an Italian term, so I'm going to give you my crazy Italian wacky accent. Legato. Legato. So say that.
Legato.
See, so if you go to your favorite Italian restaurant, say legato, they don't know what it means, but what it means is the end of one sound is the beginning of the next sound. The end of one sound is the beginning of the next sound. So there's never an end to the form that life is turning into, but there is always an end to that particular variation of that form. There's an end to that particular style. So why that's so important is that your life is functioning in that fashion, but a lot of times you don't see it because you all have an expectation of what it's supposed to turn into, and when it doesn't meet your expectation, well, that's when you start to get depressed or upset or unhappy, or you get angry at other people because they're not living up to your expectation. Or am I the only one that ever experiences that? Of course not. You do, and I do also. So the concept of prayer is not to beg God to change people. You ever prayed like that? I remember when I first became a practitioner in this teaching. Practitioner is a person who studies for 3 years, and people come to you and they ask for things. This person asked me, the first request I ever got was, can you have that woman leave that man so I could marry that man? That was the request. And I said, I'll do that prayer for $1,000. I was just testing the waters. I said, no, I can't pray for that person to leave that person, but I can pray for the perfect right person that is now trying to find you. Trying to find you, if you would but make yourself more receptive to that idea. And so I did that prayer, and about 6 weeks later, that person actually had a different person come into their lives. So the concept of trying to make somebody destroy a relationship so you can start a relationship, that doesn't work. But let's fess up, folks. A lot of us think that way. Not just about relationships, but about business and about other things too. And so it's very important that you create a consciousness of creativity, because that's what you are in the image of, that which is creating constantly. Your whole body is regenerating itself. Your whole life is regenerating itself. For you to sit in 1 second of doubt or limitation doesn't make any sense at all. Think about that. You could sit there for a second, or 2 days, or 2 years, or 20 years, and think, oh, it's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. I'm never going to be happy. The perfect right person. And you stay in this very limited context of who you are. And we have a saying for you. We have a saying for you. Even that which you think is not working is working by appearing not to work according to the way you think. In other words, if you're thinking that way, your limitation, it continues, and it continues until you change your mind about who you are, how you function on the planet. That's what Jesus was trying to explain to his disciples, was he said, pray like this. Now, he said something else interesting. He said, this is in Aramaic, Tete Ma'uth, let come your kingdom. Tete Ma'uth, say that. Tete Ma'uth. Now that could be your little mantra for this week. Tete Ma'uth, try it. Tete Ma'uth. When you're driving down the street and you're wondering, how is this problem going to be solved? Don't worry about it. Just say, let come the kingdom. In other words, let that power move by means of you into expression. Because it all comes out of the blue anyway. Don't you know that? It all comes out of the blue anyway. So you might as well just sit there and make yourself available to it as it appears. And as it does appear, then you can say, Tete Ma'uth. So Jesus starts out the prayer saying this way. He says, Awun Davashmeya Nithkadashmah Tete Ma'uth. Now I gave you a little translation form for those who are interested in the Aramaic version of this prayer. It's in your program. And if you look at Our Father, it says, Avun, who in heaven, Dawashmeya, holy be your name. Mith Kadash, which has to do with kosher, Shema, holy be your name. Te Malkutha, let come your kingdom. So that's the first part of the prayer. So when Jesus is saying this, he's setting up a consciousness. Now, in Aramaic, the word for prayer is slotha, which means to set a trap for God. Set a trap for God. So you can imagine that as humanity was trying to figure out how to get God to come into their experience and to let that life that the divine is emerge, they're trying to set a trap for this power, because they want this power to express by means of them. So it's by no mistake that the first people started to write down their ideas about God. Many of them saw God, get this, as a God of war. Now, is that not making God into human? The way you achieve things is you take control of life and you dominate. Take control and dominate. Or am I the only one that's ever thought that way? Take control and dominate. Now, if you're on the other end of that receiving, who wants to have people take control of their lives and dominate them? Nobody consciously wants that, but a lot of people don't see that happening around them. So to take back your power, in other words, to get back the remote control, like, have you ever had the remote control of the TV in somebody else's hand? Or am I the only one that drives crazy? So it's like, you want to have that remote control. To take back that control, you don't dominate the other person. You assume the authority that you already have. And you assume that authority by aligning yourself with what created you with that authority, which is the divine nature of life itself. Now, as you do that, you recognize that it's functioning, and this is the important part of this talk, it's functioning not as a judgment, not as a power separate from you, but a principle. It functions as a principle to help you decide how to define how you want to live your life. And the greatest principle in all of life is love. Using love as a definition of behavior, tone of voice, and approach. Now, who in this room has not mentally cast stones at other people? Or in your head, gossiped or negatively thought about other people? And who in this room, from time to time, has verbalized those thoughts? That's called gossip. And so it's like, and who in this room would like to have some words back that they said? Of course. So here's the point. The point is, if you want connection with God, get the connection going. And then, as you live your life, make sure you stay in tune with the principle, and don't be so quick to speak before you think. I'll say that again. Don't be so quick to speak before you do what? Think. So as the thought moves through your head, don't let your tongue give expression to it automatically. Think to yourself, is that really what I want to say? Is that really what I think? Or is that me reacting? Is that me simply reacting because that's how I learn to function in the world, is by watch others get angry or upset or mad, and they would function that way. So it's like, okay, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to open my mouth until I know that what comes out of it is pure love. I'll say that again. I'm not going to open my mouth until I know that what comes out of it is pure love. Now, how would that change your existence? Everything would change instantaneously, because you wouldn't even allow yourself to think badly of yourself in that fashion. You would always express yourself in perfect love for yourself and for everybody around you. Now, I'm telling you, what I'm saying to you is profoundly important. Profoundly important. Because if love is mastering your thought process and your expressions, then love now can emerge as who you are. And what is it that everybody in this room is looking for? We're looking for compassionate people who understand who we are and who can help us not only achieve our life goals, but help us express a greater degree of love. That's what we're looking for. So when we have that around us, then we have this ability to create this consciousness, this awareness that becomes like a magnet. Now, I'm telling you, this works. You become like a magnet where you begin to attract your good into your life. If you are willing to change the way you think, the way you speak about yourself, the way you speak about others, and never let one thing cross this is the doorway right here. This is the doorway which all that stuff comes out of. Never let anything out of this door that isn't about perfect praise and perfect love. No criticism. By the way, the greatest oxymoron, that means a complete contradiction in ideas, is the words constructive criticism. That's an oxymoron. There is nothing constructive about criticism. All criticism is intended to elevate the person being critical, so that they can say, I just know a lot more than you do. Now, the only pass on that is ministers. I'm kidding. I can't even be critical of myself or of you. Instead, I can be supportive, loving, and nurturing. So it's like when you start to think this way, and you start to feel this way, there is this beautiful combination of the feminine and the masculine together. Now I want to close this talk today with a story that comes from Clarissa Pinkola Estes' book on Women Who Run with the Wolves. It's a terrific book. Men who see that title think it's women who are trying to be more masculine in business, but that's not what the book is about. The book is about how you blend the masculine and feminine together. And there's one story in there, it's called Skeleton Woman. It's a story of a young Eskimo girl who disobeys her father's authority. Her father is so angry at her that he takes her to a cliff and he kills her and pushes her into a bay. And so she's living at the bottom of the bay, drowned. And later on, a young Eskimo man who's a fisherman, and that's what he does for the village, he catches fish. He's out fishing, and the fog drives him into this bay, because most of the time, nobody goes into this bay because they know it's occupied by the spirit of this young woman. But he doesn't know this, as many young men who are in the fog don't know who they are. My favorite part of the story. So, he's in the bay, and he feels this huge tug on his fishing line. Huge tug. And he's thinking the size of this fish is phenomenal. I will impress the entire village because I will feed the village for a whole week on this fish because the fish is tugging so hard and he's pulling so hard and he finally pulls the line up and out pops the skeleton. And he's completely terrified because most young men are terrified about things like that. They thought one thing, up comes another, and they start running like most young men do. So he's paddling his boat as fast as he can. Of course, the skeleton is attached to the line, but he can't figure that out yet because the skeleton is hopping along the water following him. So he jumps out of his boat, he runs right into the village, and there's the skeleton doing what? Right behind him. And he runs right into his igloo, which is in complete pitch darkness, which is what most men do. They run into complete darkness. The skeleton slides right in next to him and sits right next to him inside the igloo. And of course, he's just totally out of breath and scared. And he lights the lamp, and there it is. And then he realizes, it's just a skeleton. Why was I so afraid? So he unhooks the skeleton, pushes it off to the side. He's exhausted, falls asleep. And he begins to cry. Because that's the only time men can grieve, is when they're sleeping. They can't consciously allow anybody to see that. So he's crying. And the skeleton feels the energy of that, gets up and leans over it, puts a little bit of that drop of the tear on their finger, and begins to flush out. The skeleton knows that's not enough, so she reaches in and grabs his heart and pulls it out. Ba-boom, ba-boom, and with every beat of his heart, she flushes out more. Finally, she returns to her regular sense of beingness, puts the heart back, and she lays down next to him. And they awake in the morning. They awake as if they have never been apart. Never been apart. There's a part of you that's chasing you. It's what you're afraid of. If you would stop and let it catch up, you'd find that it's that part of you which wants you to be a loving, accepting, compassionate person.